Well, hello everyone. Here we are coming at you live from my basement. And as promised, I'm going to give you a little bit of recording, a little recording on a few of the things from chapter 10. Chapter 10 is all about human services in the healthcare setting. So we're kind of going to go over a few things there, what that looks like in a few places. And then we're going to move on into talking about what are some key bits of knowledge that you will need in that setting. And then also, what are some skill sets that would be advantageous to you in that setting? What are some things you can expect with all of that too? All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started because as I said before, you know, those long YouTube things, never fun. So I'm gonna share my screen here. We're gonna go and we're gonna jump in and go through a few things as well. All right, so talking about the healthcare and hospice settings. And human services is deeply intertwined with all of this. I'm sure many of you have seen the social worker at the hospital, or maybe someone that is an advocate, or someone that's trying to connect people who are there or are leaving with a number of services in order to get them the help that they need. There's a ton of different roles. So it can be all the way to like the formal social worker who's there and is overseeing people, uh, working with some people who need to get basic needs met, or maybe working with their family members in some way. But there's a whole host of other ones too. Um, we're going to leave hospice care for a little bit down the road because we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, and that's its own sort of thing. But one way that's really coming that's really coming up is you'll see human service workers in ER settings more and more. In particular, uh, as I said, the formal social workers on one end, and on the other end, um, are some people like a friend of mine who recently got a job in an ER setting, and he is a recovery specialist, and he has walked path of recovery himself. And the deal that he and his agency have with the ER room is that he gets called anytime that there's an overdose that comes in, so that when that person wakes up, or they're brought to, or they're coherent, they're talking with a recovery specialist who has been there and done that, and has actually been in the same situation that they are in now. And the hospital's finding that, hey, this is really good. People tend to connect a little bit better and are a little bit more open then to getting some services, getting into some recovery groups, or whatever help they may need. So the thing is that when you're in that healthcare setting, there's often a lot of stress because nobody likes to go to the hospital anyway, right? I mean, let's be honest. It's yucky. You go there and you much rather be at home. I mean, hey, if I'm going to be sick or if I'm going to be feeling bad, I'd much rather be at home. I mean, the food's better at home, right? And then normally the TV is bigger at home because they got those real tiny TVs and everything else. So and then you can't have everybody in. And I mean, what if you want your dog there on your lap and stuff? There's a host of different issues that are there in that hospital setting that make it uncomfortable for many people. And so one thing that I want you to be aware of is that if you're working in a setting like that, how you do the job is far more important than what you do in the job. By that I mean, be human with people. There are a number of different things to think about when you go into these settings and situations. Um, Part of it has to do with some crisis counseling and trauma informed approach. Now we actually have a whole entire class on this, so I'm not going to go into this in depth. Part of the trauma informed approach would be just changing little bits of language, not what's wrong with you, never what's wrong with you, but hey, what happened to you. It's coming alongside some people and realizing that working within the confines of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I mean, if somebody's there in a hospital, generally it is due to some health-based needs. So you have to look at those first needs, that first tier of food, shelter, health, all those things. We're going to want to talk about those things first before moving on. Um, but also what's very important is to develop a skill set, particularly a skill set for single visits and being able to do rapid assessment, because sometimes the person may have to be out at a certain time due to insurance or for a number of reasons. Hospital checkout time may be at 11 a.m. and so they can't stay longer than that because they might get charged more. There's a whole host of reasons why timetables and things may be sped up. So the fact of the matter is you may not get as much time with a person that you want. So you want to be able to develop a skill set in order to maximize your time and the efficacy of what you are doing, or the effectiveness of what you're doing. So here's the seven skills. This is mentioned on page I believe it's 229, 230 in your book. But it's the skill to quickly be able to put someone at ease. Now, this doesn't mean you go in there and you're going to tell knock knock jokes, right? No, but it has to do more of establishing a rapport and that sense of trust quickly. It has to do more with your presence rather than what you're saying all the time. What you got to realize is don't worry about, oh, I have to have the right thing to say or anything like that. In fact, I think what helps more is to be able to go in and establish that sense of rapport, that where you're identifying with people. Now, this doesn't mean to say, hey, you've got a kidney stone. Well, I had a kidney stone last night too. No, that's kind of ridiculous. But rather being able to be kind and polite. A smile does an awful lot to set people at ease. Another thing is to exhibit competency. Now, exhibiting competency can be done many ways. Honestly, it doesn't matter how many letters you have after your name, it shows if you can't do a job. And so to be able to walk in there and to be competent and confident in yourself and your skills is a very, very valuable thing. So no looking like a scared rabbit, right? Be cool under pressure. You might have to practice some of the things that you're going to say in front of a mirror before you say them. I know it sounds quirky, but the truth is it actually does work. Working on your active listening and empathic listening, all of that together, working on all of those skills, that's stuff that we're going to talk about in 103. That's really good. Being non-judgmental. This also has to do with some of your listening skills, and that's not having, it's by learning to identify the filters that we hear things through and being able to shut those off. Someone may be from basically a completely different world. Maybe they're from a completely different socioeconomic class than what you are familiar with at all. So when they're talking about some of their problems, you have absolutely no idea what that's like. And so the thing is not to show your unease, but also to be open to what they're saying and to be able to take that in. Always be able to provide your needed information quickly and organize support services. Now, this, a lot of people, I guess I don't want to give the wrong idea here. This means more than just like having a brochure or a list of numbers. Okay? You want to be able to refer well. And so one thing that I do advocate is if you have that brochure, if you have those list of numbers, make sure you called some of these places in advance. Get the names of the people who are going to answer the phone. Talk to some of the people there. Establish a relationship yourself, because if you've done steps 1 and 2, if you put someone at ease and you've established rapport and that sense of trust, then when you have these services that you're going to refer them to, you can say, hey, call my friend at this place, such and such a place, or at that place. They'll take care of you. Hey, I know this person there. It may not be the person that's answering the phone this time, but I have a friend that works there, and so I know a little bit about it. There's that psychological thing that people have is you're transferring your trust and that authority to someone else. And it actually works, people. It actually works. So take the time to not only know what services are out there, but also to contact them yourselves. It will increase the likelihood of your clients actually following through and getting with those other services as well. Now, when it comes to some special knowledge that you will need in this setting, that would be the Affordable Care Act. Now, a lot of this is covered in your book, and a lot of us have really lived with this for a while. But the Affordable Care Act, it's also referred to as Obamacare, and it kind of goes with the whole idea that everyone should have access to healthcare. Now, I'm going to step aside from that because the book doesn't mention like the what we have in Indiana, which is the Healthy Indiana Plan. That's a little bit different. The HIP plan is actually, I believe there were two states that follow this model. Indiana has been doing it successfully for, I think, about 10 years now. I'm not quite sure, but the idea is that um, the Healthy Indiana Plan will take people and it will give them actual insurance from Indiana companies, and the concept is that the money will stay in Indiana, and the referrals will stay in Indiana as much as possible. And on the flip side, there will be a sliding scale so that small business owners, low income people, they can still afford the insurance. And then on top of that, they're not going to deal with this thing called they're not going to make pre-existing conditions a barrier. Now, the Healthy Indiana Plan is actually very important because in many human services settings in Indiana, it's one of the first things that they'll do is try and hook you up with the Healthy Indiana Plan and one of the insurances there. You'll find this at a lot of residential care facilities, particularly along with some drug rehab facilities and things of that nature. It's a really great thing that we have in Indiana. And so I would advise you also to get familiar with that, because trust me, if you're going to work human services in this state, that's going to come up. Now we have the hospice movement. The philosophy behind the hospice movement is to look at each individual with both with the need for care on every part of the spectrum. So there is physical care that needs to happen. There's emotional support that needs to happen. There's social support in as much as their community, their family, their friends, people around them. And then it also acknowledges people as spiritual beings, and so therefore spiritual support. So you'll have what's called a hospice care team. Now, the hospice care team is normally made up. You'll have the healthcare worker. You will have the social services worker. You'll have clergy on there, and they will all work together in this thing that is hospice. Now, the hospice movement itself actually goes back to confronting and challenging some more of the modern Western views of death. You see, in our present culture, which is a modern Western culture, death is seen as a failure. It's seen as a failure. Oh, the medical community failed to save them. Oh, they could have fought harder. It's seen as a failure in many, many aspects. Even some of the language that's associated with it. The goal, see, the problem is when your only goal is physical healing, then inevitably you're going to be talking about death as a failure. But the hospice movement has said, actually, death is a natural part of life. It just happens on long enough timeline. Guess what? We're all going to go. So the hospice movement says, instead of looking at it as a failure, let's look at death with dignity. And instead of making it cold and sterile, where you might be in a hospital, and that may be the right setting for some people, the hospice movement was saying, what about being able to die in one's home, choosing to die in one's home with one's family around them, in a comfortable setting? Is that not more comfortable for people? And so from that, the hospice movement was born. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Hospice can be brought in not only to deal with people in their home environment, which which represents a big change from what it was, but also to deal with people in various facilities as well. So uh, the the thing about the hospice movement is that when they're looking at it as as addressing each and every aspect of a person, the physical, the emotional, the social, and spiritual, as you're reading this stuff in your book, the one of the things to ask yourself is, what are the pros and cons of this? What's the good? What's the bad? And what can this? How can this help people? Now, the nice thing is, in with that human services component in there, which is pretty much everything except the healthcare worker, with that human services component in there, you're addressing not only the individual, but you're also looking at end of life care in that individual's immediate family and community. This can make a great difference when it comes to dealing with bereavement and grief, access to grief counseling for many people as well, helping people to get their affairs in order. It's a huge thing. Helping people to do some planning even before in those end of life scenarios before they pass, so that when it comes to funeral expenses, I mean, they're not gonna break the bank, but rather they can do some planning themselves for things that would matter more to them and would speak more to them and to their immediate families as well. Now, a hospice team, like I said, it can consist of representatives from all different areas. I like this picture because this picture kind of brings in a whole bunch from a number of areas. And it addresses everything from health to spirituality to social services to relationships and community. It does all of these things, and the hospice team works together so that end of life care is peaceful and also with dignity. Now, there's a few things. Remember, I said we had some specialized information, right? So, in this setting, when it comes to hospice care and end of life care, terminally ill, there are some things that you will need to get down. The first one is accepting the reality of death. As I said, long enough timeline. Hey, we all die. It's accepting that reality of death. And so, when someone's talking about it and they are terminally ill, maybe the thing to do is not to say, oh, no, 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 don't talk like that. You're not going to die or anything. But maybe what they're trying to do is actually talk about this, because for them, hey, guess what? For all of us, it's a step that none of us have taken. It's the unknown for us. So being someone who can just listen to them and be there as they talk it out is a good thing. It's very helpful. What's also helpful is, as many of them are feeling that their lives are spinning out of control, their health is, and certainly some of the decisions they're making, they may or may not be able to make all of the decisions about their care and things like that. Then comes in advanced planning. There are a number of different things. These four things are things that you will have to know: the advanced directives, do not resuscitate order, living wills, power of attorney. And while we think a lot of these things are ironclad when it comes to the moment of what the hospital has to listen to, you would be surprised. Actually, the most ironclad of all of these happen to be living wills and power of attorney. Many, depending on the hospital, depending on the situation, they do not always have to honor the do not resuscitate order. It can get a little sticky. It can get a little sticky in there. Normally, if something is signed with a hospital that a person is involved with, they're they're okay and everything will be okay. But then the hospital will also look at it a lot of times like, okay, this hospital will not take heroic efforts, but the ambulance, they may not see it that way. So you see, there's a number of things that are out there and in place. So it pays to research those, or at least know those definitions for a test. Another thing that you'll be looking at is some grief counseling. This is a this of course is a big part of all of working with the terminally ill, end of life care. We do have actually an entire class on this, HUMS 140, loss and grief. Uh, Grief counseling. The reason grief counseling is actually a really good thing to know is that we tend to associate grief with the whole death and dying thing. But let me just take um, let me, let me take a sidestep on this for a moment. And the fact is that when we grieve, what we are grieving is the connection that is lost. That's what we're grieving. Now, that loss can come through an incident of death or dying, but it may come in many other forms. And you will see people go through stages similar, like saying when dealing with job loss, when dealing with other types of loss as well. Maybe even if it's as they are getting older and dealing with things, loss of health. So grief counseling comes to bear in many forms. Also in the hospice movement, let's remember that we talked, there's actually a spiritual component. And so as a human service worker, guess what? If you're there, people will look to you as a professional. Why? Because you are. And so therefore, the spiritual component is another thing that we have to be comfortable with. So you have to ask yourself going in, you have to ask yourself some questions. Hey, am I okay with religious expression? Even if it's religious expression that I'm totally unfamiliar with. Maybe they are of an entirely different religion or something like that. Am I okay with that? Uh, Also, are you okay if a group were to ask you to join into prayer with them? If you're there with them at that time, they might ask you. It may, and they may at that time join in prayer. And this could be this could be any number of religions that would do this, but you have to ask yourself, hey, am I going to be important? Am I going to be okay with that in that time? And I say all of this stuff because when you wind up in those times, it's really good to ask yourself those questions beforehand so that you've dealt with them, because it goes back to that whole thing of showing competence and confidence. You know what I mean? It's really important. And so asking yourself these questions is good. The truth of the matter is, when it comes down to it, whether or not you agree with your client on matters of spirituality, if spirituality and spiritual expression is important to your client, then guess what? You have to show, you have to be okay with that. You have to uh, you have to show that in some way that is important to you. You don't have to agree with it, but then again, it's not a time for you to argue with it, and it's not, and which is not your place anyway. Your place is to support them. So if spirituality is important to them, guess what? Look at it this way: it's important to you, because it's all about the client. It's all about the client. Now, another thing is that what I find very common in these end of life scenarios is that people just start asking some tough questions on suffering and purpose in life. Those questions will come. I honestly think, because if you are displaying some active listening, this always goes back to the 7 steps and that skill set right there. If you're displaying some empathy, some active listening, think about it. They may be at a time where they got people bustling around who are talking about arrangements, people who are talking about their health and everything else. No one's really listening to them, they feel. And so, as they are talking to you, they've suddenly found someone who will listen not only to them right now, but to other things that they've been wondering. And if they want to talk, and they want to talk about some of these things, I mean, I'm certainly not going to say, oh no, hey, we can talk about the weather, we can talk about the ball game last night, but we can't talk about you know the nature of suffering or purpose in life. uh, no, rather, remember, it's all about the client. So if they want to talk about those things, hey, that's good. it pays to kind of ask yourself some of these things beforehand, and to also be very careful about how you are going to express things. Because remember, you're not there to sway them one way or the other or anything like that. If nothing else, remember, you are there to listen. And we'll get in, and in HUMS 103, we're going to get into a little bit more about how to listen more effectively. Now, why is all of this important? Well, there's a big study done for human services students who, after their education, said, okay, here are some areas that are out there. What ones did you feel your education was ill-equipped or did not equip you enough for? 60% of them said that when it came to effective bereavement counseling, they felt their education was lacking. And so that's why this stuff is very, very important, to think some of these things through. I mean, hey, if you get the chance and you want to take HUMS 140, Loss and Grief, or you want to take another class or something like that a little bit later on, get into a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper on your own time with some of the developmental classes. I mean, that's great. I highly recommend these things. But if you don't get those chances, I'd say still take some time and realize this stuff is going to happen. It's going to happen. And just think through some of these things beforehand. Because as always, you want to exhibit that confidence and competence, which helps set people at ease and will help facilitate your work even better. A few things to remember, particularly when it comes to the hospice movement and dying, is that there are numerous cultural perceptions of dying when it comes to death and everything. I have a picture here of El Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, the Day of the Dead. So there are different cultures that look at death different way. There are different religions that look at death different ways. It also pays to look at some of these things so that you don't have one of those moments where you have that cultural faux pas where you say something that kind of elicits that whole what are you talking about from your client, but rather to be familiar with how your clients and your client's culture and or religion views death and dying. Also, when it comes to the hospice movement, there is a discussion in there, euthanasia and the hospice philosophy. There's actually about 3 different types of euthanasia. These things are all important, whether you're talking physician assisted or you're talking euthanasia by refusing treatment, or the whole just unplugging, as it were. Many people may have some directives in place, says, beyond such and such a time, maybe beyond 3 days, heroic efforts are not to be taken in regards to the continuation for my life. And they may sign an advance directive that has something that says something of that nature. Since you're the professional, if you're talking to somebody, they're going to be asking you about these definitions. They're going to be asking you about these things. So it pays to be a little mindful of them beforehand. Well, as I promised, wanted to keep this short and sweet. So as always, if you have any questions, please get in contact with me and I'll reach out to you. I'll get back with you as soon as possible. We can set up a Zoom, or if you just have something real quick, I can answer you in a message, and that's fine. Also, remember that I will be getting out the exam study guide for this next exam, and that way you'll be able to go through that stuff as well. All right, thanks a lot, and hey, I'll see you next week.